there an AA program for food?
Oh my! Should I go to OA or FA or FAA or GSA?
Yikes, how many of these groups are there?
No idea. How do I choose?
There's been offshoots of AA: Cocaine Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Al-Anon, and of course, OverEaters Anonymous. But hold on, did you know that there are over 10 different 12-step groups specifically dedicated to helping individuals with food addiction? I think there might actually be 14 or 16. If you're looking for help in the food addiction world, it can get pretty overwhelming to figure out which one of these groups is best suited for you, if any of them are. In today's talk, I'd like to focus on the available 12-step programs for food addiction and try to shed light on the differing approaches and benefits that these groups can offer. You want to ask the question, why are there so many of these groups in the first place? Historically, some groups emerged from OA, and so they've been around a long time, and others developed over time, often in rebuttal to OA. Others started outside of OA. Location, many started in the US, one started in Australia. Then there's the question of, is this a spiritual program primarily, or is it a physical addiction? Some groups would say we have to deal with the spiritual malady first. We have to look at the 12 steps themselves, and that will help us get abstinent. Whereas other groups will say, no, we have to acknowledge the addiction, food addiction, and we have to be abstinent of our foods, and then we can use the spiritual piece to support that. Then comes the definition of, well, what is abstinence? Is abstinence from sugar and flour and grains? Does it have to include weighing and measuring? So many different definitions, and each group has their own. Let's get started. OverEaters Anonymous. The first food addiction, eating addiction programs. It was established in 1960, and it is still the largest and most well-known 12-step program for individuals with eating issues. Roseanne S. started the first meeting in Los Angeles, California, and it has grown to now over 60,000 members, or 6,500 groups in over 75 countries. Interestingly, about 85% of members are women, and 75% of all members are over the age of 50. OverEaters Anonymous follows the principles of Alcoholics Anonymous, but focuses instead on food issues. It's one of the only groups that I've been able to find actual rates of success. Almost 60% have lost weight and maintained that weight loss, because that's not very common. Usually by the 5-year mark, about 25% keep off their weight. OverEaters Anonymous does not endorse a specific food plan. It allows members to define their own plan. It follows a principle that's called dignity of choice. OverEaters Anonymous used to have 3 specific food plans, but they stopped them, mainly to avoid controversy within the fellowship. There were members who were reluctant to give dietary advice because they weren't nutritionists, and others who said, we need to have a specific guideline. It was very hard to come to a consensus. OA stepped back and said, we're going to call it dignity of choice. So you define what your own sobriety with your sponsor, and no requirement to weigh and measure food. OA is a pretty loose program. You define your own sobriety with your sponsor, but the advantage is that there are many meetings. You have to shop around and find the meetings that will work for you. So that's OverEaters Anonymous. Now, within OverEaters Anonymous, there are actually some well-known subgroups. Still OverEaters Anonymous, but a specific subgroup within OverEaters Anonymous HOW, or OA-HOW. OverEaters Anonymous, honesty, openness, willingness. This subset of OA originated in the 1980s. The goal was to give more structure with the food plan. A group of people said, all right, we want to have some rules. We're going to eliminate sugar and flour, and we want the requirement of weighing and measuring their foods. It might be 4 ounces of protein and 1 ounce of fat and 8 or 16 ounces of carbohydrates. They also instituted a new rule, which was we want to have people in meetings only speak if they've had 3 months or 90 days of abstinence. Why would that happen? They believed that when people came into OA meetings, remember there were no rules, that there would be a number of people who just never got any kind of sobriety and ended up using the meeting as a place to dump their frustration. I can't get sober, I don't know what's wrong with me. A lot of people would be saying, yeah, we can't do this, getting together and commiserating. And OverEaters Anonymous HOW, OA-HOW, said we want to have only the people who have actually found sobriety based on the rules that we've made talk about their experience, strength, and hope, so that the newcomers who come into the meeting are not discouraged by all these people who are not doing a good job of their sobriety. Then in the 1990s, another group, also a subset of OA, called OA, A Vision for You. They said, we agree that we don't want a specific food plan. We certainly don't want to have weighing and measuring. There's too much focus on the food. This is a spiritual program. AA is fundamentally a spiritual program as well as a psychological and physical program. We wanted to focus on the principles of the AA Big Book. The idea was if you focused on the spiritual, your sobriety would be more easily attained. There wasn't that much focus on the food, it was more on going through the steps. This was a great program that would appeal to people who wanted a less rigid approach and to use the Big Book, the AA platform, for their spiritual solution. That started in the 1990s. OA-HOW and OverEaters Anonymous, A Vision for You, are significantly smaller than OA. They're just subsections of OA. The next group that I want to talk about are Gray Sheeters Anonymous. Unlike the other two, they're not subsects of OA. They are a splinter group from OA. They started in OverEaters Anonymous in 1960, then split off and became their own separate group in the 1990s. When OA had its 3 distinct food groups before the dignity of choice, it had one food plan that was on a gray sheet. It was literally on a gray sheet. I think the others were on different colored sheets. When OA went to dignity of choice, there were a number of people who continued to follow the gray sheet plan, but they still called themselves OA, gray sheet OA, but split off in the 1990s. They got their own book, the Gray Sheet Anonymous book, and no longer used the OA literature or the OA name. They said to determine what sobriety is, you have to eliminate sugar and flour and grains, and you have to weigh and measure foods. There were foods you weren't allowed to eat, like avocado, potatoes, specific foods that you couldn't eat, and other foods that you could. This was not between you and your sponsor, it was according to this gray sheet. Over the years, that gray sheet has adapted somewhat, but not very much. The meetings were intended to be positive pitches, although you did not have to be abstinent when you spoke. The goal was always to speak with your successes so that you could be a source of encouragement and strength for the other people listening. This is a fairly small group of maybe 60 meetings, 4,000 or 5,000 members. Pretty small group in relation to the larger OA. Another group that formed in the 1980s called Recovery from Food Addiction, or RFA. Kay Shepard, who was one of the leading pioneers in the food addiction field in the 1970s and 80s, published a book called Food Addiction, The Body Knows. Based on her book and her belief that the 12-step AA program could be adapted for food addiction recovery, she developed a structured food plan that eliminates sugar and flour and wheat, and it also demanded that you weigh and measure your food. I'm not sure how big this program is. It's probably around the same size as GSA. The next group is Food Addicts Anonymous. This is another splinter group from OverEaters Anonymous, founded in West Palm Beach, Florida, and boasts about 100 meetings. They also eliminate sugar and flour and wheat and require weighing and measuring foods. Like GSA, they felt OA was too loose with guidelines to help the newcomer. Probably the biggest group next to OA is Food Addicts in Recovery Anonymous. Another splinter group that came out of OverEaters Anonymous. This group started in the late 1980s in Massachusetts. Like the other groups, they wanted a specific food plan, eliminating sugar and flour, so you could eat grains on this program, but not sugar and flour. You had to weigh and measure food. You didn't always have to weigh and measure food. At a restaurant, for example, GSA, you had to take your scale to a restaurant. And they had rules about how members couldn't speak until 90 days of sobriety. This group is much bigger than GSA or CEA-HOW or OA A Vision for You. I'm not sure why it's so big. It's not that much different than the others. My hunch, though, is that it has a very strong outreach as part of its fellowship. I know that I myself, in my work in food addiction, have been approached a couple of times by their volunteer recruiters. I've never heard of a GSA or an CEA-HOW approaching anybody. Newcomers usually are informed word of mouth by these smaller programs. Secular Overeaters Anonymous. This started in 2017 with, as you can guess, the intent to avoid the spiritual or religious undertones of Overeaters Anonymous. It takes the OA literature but has adapted it to remove all the religious references in its attempt to be inclusive of agnostics and atheists. This is primarily an online group, unlike the others that I've mentioned so far, which are now online thanks to COVID, but before COVID were primarily face-to-face meetings. I have no idea how big this group is. How do you measure something that's online? There's no specific food plan, no specific requirement to weigh and measure foods, and no absent requirement to speak. It's basically an OA group that is secularized. Compulsive Eaters Anonymous, which is CEA-HOW, is the next group. This started in '96 in Los Angeles, California, and it's similar to OA-HOW with its structured approach, but it didn't originate from Overeaters Anonymous. There is a structured food plan, but it's determined by the sponsor and the sponsee. It usually means eliminating sugar and flour, but it might not. Like it's between you and your sponsor. It does require weighing and measuring foods. So it's very similar to OA-HOW, but it did not come from Overeaters Anonymous. Sugar and Carbs Addicts Anonymous. This group started in, it's not clear to me if it was 2010 or 2020, and it focuses on carbohydrates, to acknowledge that there is a sugar and carbohydrate addiction. It does not have a specific food plan, but it does recommend that you avoid sugar and flour and grains, with the belief that all of these are carbohydrates, which will eventually metabolize into sugar and be addictive. They have no requirement of weighing and measuring, and there's no abstinent requirement to speak. They are primarily online, 24/7 chat rooms, or Zoom meetings or phone. Food Compulsions Anonymous started in 1985. It was intended to help individuals who struggle with various forms of eating disorders, including compulsive overeating, but also eating disorders like bulimia and binge eating disorder. So not really focusing just on the addiction piece, but on the eating disorder piece. This group is primarily online and has phone contact. There's no food plan, there's no requirement to weigh and measure foods. Along the same lines, Anorexic and Bulimics Anonymous. Here, the focus is on eating disorders, looking at the eating behavior itself rather than specific food plans. There is no food plan. But what's interesting about this one is that somebody else should plan and prepare and serve the meals. You are not in charge of your food. It's looking at the eating behavior itself. And there's certainly no requirement to weigh and measure food. You don't want to focus on the food, you want to focus on the behavior. That is the typical difference between an eating disorder and a food addiction anyway. Another similar group, Eating Disorders Anonymous, has the same idea. Now this group started in 2000, and it focuses similarly on the psychological aspects of eating disorders instead of looking at the food alone. It includes all eating disorders like anorexia, bulimia, binge eating disorder. There's no food plan, no requirement to weigh and measure foods, no abstinent requirement to speak. The New Zealand group that started in 1983 called Addictive Eaters Anonymous. It started in New Zealand, but it does have an international presence. It emphasizes the principles of the 12 steps for recovery, and it has online and face-to-face meetings. Here's an interesting group, Carnivore Anonymous. Now you would think with that title that it would be a carnivore group. Makes sense. A lot of people following a food addiction food plan are carnivores, or at the very least keto. No, this is a group that was developed by a psychiatrist, I think probably in the last 5 years, and it follows a plant-based food plan. It's the opposite of what you would expect. There's no food plan per se, except that it has to be plant-based and no, not carnivore. There's no requirement for weighing and measuring, and I believe it is just online. It follows the principles of the 12-step program. I'd be really interested in anybody who's been as part of this group. If you want a Buddhist approach to addiction recovery, Dharma was started in 2019 by Noah Levin, a Buddhist teacher and author. It offers a non-12-step Buddhist approach to recovery from all addictions, not specifically food. It's a very large community of over 10,000 people, 300 meetings online. There are in-person meetings that do exist, but the biggest presence is online. Obviously, no food requirements because it's not a food-based program, but people can use it for their food issues. If you want something that's exclusively Christian, there is something called Overcomers Outreach. This is a Christian-based program that blends the 12 steps with biblical references. This was started in 1985 by Bob and Pauline Bartosh in California, and it too looks at all addictions, including food. That's a lot of meetings. How are you going to decide based on what I've told you? Do you want strict food guidelines? Do you want to weigh and measure your foods? Are you more interested in the strong support of a group or a sponsor? Do you want online or face-to-face? Look below in the notes and you'll see my PDF, which gives a nice breakdown of the various programs. And it also includes the links so that you can either phone or email or online and find the information. I would encourage you to check out one of these meetings. Go to at least 6 meetings of a particular fellowship before you decide that fellowship is not for you. It might be that specific meeting has a quality about it that will be appealing or not appealing, or there might be a personality which gives a flavor of the meeting. You won't know that until you've gone to a number of meetings. Look into the 12-step programs and try to find a way that will make it work for you, because these programs are free and they're ubiquitous. Now that there are so many programs virtually, it's an easy source of support. I hope you find something that works for you. Thank you.